Have you ever felt like giving up on something that you know you were supposed to be doing? Like knowing this is something that was important. This is something that you knew this was like the thing that you were supposed to be doing. God had set you on this path and you just felt like giving up. Have you ever felt like God called you down a specific path, but you weren't sure if you wanted to do it? When we moved down to Texas so I could go to seminary, I knew that was what God was calling me to do. I had no doubt. I was confident. He had confirmed that decision in a lot of different ways, through different circumstances, through different people. But it was just clear that that's what we were supposed to do. But then seminary started. And the first semester wasn't bad. I enjoyed it. It was a lot of work, but I really enjoyed it. Second semester started, and with that came Honors Greek with Dr. Dan Wallace. I learned the meaning of pain. Don't get me wrong, I enjoyed this class because I was learning a lot. But the problem was I was also at that time taking a class on Genesis through Judges, Trinitarianism, world missions, and I was also taking a spiritual formation course. That was just school, though. I also wanted to stay married, so that needed to be another priority in my life. We had 5 kids at the time, and I wanted to still know them by the time I actually got out of school. But we also needed to eat, and so I was working, pretty much close to full-time hours. And then sleep has to squeeze in there at some point. And Misty knows pretty much the only thing I talked about for that year while I was taking Honors Greek was Greek. That's all I talked about. I literally would dream about Greek vocabulary. Those are not good dreams. You don't sleep well when you're trying to figure out, okay, this is the nominative form of erchomai. It just doesn't work. And so doing this, memorizing 700 Greek vocabulary words plus their different forms, translating back and forth from Greek to English and then English to Greek. Let's see, what else was I doing here? It was memorizing the different verb paradigms, accent marks, and the syntax. It didn't leave me much time to do anything else. I pretty much know I took those other courses. I don't remember them. And I was stressed. I mean, there were times where I was frustrated, I was tired, and I wanted to quit. There were days where I was on my way to school, and I had the thought of, I wonder how far I could go before anyone realized I wasn't coming back. It was not a good situation. I wanted to be done. I wanted rest. I didn't want to do it anymore, even though I knew that's what God had called me to do. I was done. But I knew that I was there because God wanted me to be there. And so I didn't stop, and I was going to discipline myself so that I would keep going. I could go without sleep for a little while because there was fall break, which still is going to be filled with homework. And then Christmas break, which required more studying because Greek 2 was coming the next semester. And spring break, well, with Honors Greek, spring break doesn't exist because you have to read his Greek manuscript on syntax and grammar over spring break. That was a requirement then. So I didn't get spring break. But I made it to summer. And I survived because I didn't give up. And while I barely passed Greek 1, I mean it, 1 point away from failing that class. I'm not joking. I was that far away from failing Greek 1. I got a new job that allowed me more time to study, and I finished Greek 2 with an A. It's amazing what time can do. And and I was rewarded for my effort. Hard work does bring rewards. And so when I got to Greek 3, and Greek 3 at Dallas Theological Seminary used to be known as the hardest class in the seminary until they started Honors Greek. I got into Greek 3, and we get through the first class. And for those of you that went to college, you get syllabus shock, right? All of a sudden, you're presented with everything you're going to have to do that semester, and you're just sitting there. Those of us that took Dr. Wallace's Greek class for that first year, we stepped outside and we're just visiting, having a good time. And we see these other students come out and they're like, I don't know, we've never done this. We looked at each other and literally one of them asked, when does it get hard? That was one of the easiest semesters I had. And that was even though I was also taking Hebrew 1 at the same time. It was, relatively speaking, relaxing. There was a reward. And I said last week that if we want to produce or to develop something that is good and of value, it requires effort. It requires endurance. It requires commitment, especially if we are trying to develop good spiritual habits in our lives or as we minister in the lives of other people. And I want to add that that we need to turn off our iPhone. I want to add that the discipline and the effort that is required of us to have a faithful ministry also comes with a reward. Last week we went through the first of Paul's three illustrations that he uses to encourage Timothy in his ministry. And today we're going to cover the second of these. Last week we covered the soldier. This week we're going to talk about the athlete and the farmer. And each of the illustrations that he uses, it shows the effort and the dedication that is required, but they also bring out what it looks like when faithful ministry is accomplished. He brings out what the reward is. And so like an athlete and a farmer, a faithful minister must have faithful endurance and disciplined commitment. And so he starts off talking about here with the athlete's discipline. An athlete trains with purpose. Now let's go ahead and let's go back. We're going to read 2 Timothy chapter 2, verses 3 through 7. And Paul is writing to Timothy here, and he says, "Suffer hardship with me as a good soldier of Christ Jesus. No soldier in active service entangles himself in the affairs of everyday life, so that he may please the one who enlisted him as a soldier. Also, if anyone competes as an athlete, he does not win the prize unless he competes according to the rules. The hard-working farmer ought to be the first to receive his share of the crops. Consider what I say, for the Lord will give you understanding in everything." And an athlete trains with purpose. Athletes prepare with discipline and focus, knowing what their goal is. So what we see here, first of all, the athlete will train with discipline. The best athletes don't randomly decide when they get up in the morning, I might train today, or maybe I'll just watch movies, eat popcorn and M&Ms. I don't know. We'll decide. No, that is not the attitude that an Olympic athlete is going to have. They're get up, and before they're even out of bed, they're starting to think through how they're going to train that day. They're thinking through what they are going to do. An athlete who wants to succeed is disciplined and trains whether they feel like it or not. And I know some athletes who they'll train and they really don't feel like it. They would much rather stay in bed. But their goal motivates them. Their goal drives them, and they're going to do it, and they discipline themselves so that they can succeed, because they know that their success depends on whether they train or not. Their success depends on whether or not they will push through the pain. And it hurts. If you ever get the chance to look at the feet of like a marathoner when they're done with their race, first of all, don't look those pictures up. It's gross. Because their feet are worn. It hurts. There's blisters and sores and ew. But they push through the pain because their goal is victory. So they train with discipline, and we also see that their training is focused. And I can guarantee you that a sprinter trains very differently than a weightlifter. The very basics of what they do might look the same, but when it comes down to the training for their specific event, it's going to look very, very different. And so while they have the same goal, their goal is success, because success in their different events looks differently. Usain Bolt, the sprinter, trains differently than Simone Biles, the gymnast. We're not going to see Usain Bolt doing cartwheels off of a balance beam, although I might pay to watch that. But because their success will look different, their training will look different. But they are disciplined and they are focused because they know what their goal is. Okay, so that's just the athlete there. They're disciplined and focused. But Paul isn't specifically talking about athletes. He's using that as an illustration for Christian life and ministry. What we should all be doing. And so just as an athlete must train, a believer must grow in faithfulness and commitment. Just as athletes train with discipline, faithful ministers are to train themselves with discipline. We need to be training ourselves with discipline. Our spiritual growth, our health, our ministries depend on our spiritual training. If we want to make a difference in someone's life, and if we want to have a successful ministry, we need to make sure that we are prepared to do so. That we're not just sitting around, that we are making ourselves ready for when we have the chance to share the gospel with someone, to give them the hope for the future. We might not feel like reading the Bible. We might not feel like praying. We might not feel like going to church and being around people. Like I said, we went to a relatively large church down in Texas. There were Sunday mornings when I woke up and said, I don't want to go, not because I don't want to go to church, I just don't want to be around people. I don't get that quite as much here. I don't get it peopled out as I used to, because I have to go searching for people. But it happens. But these are some of the tools that are critical to our spiritual health, our growth, and our ministry. If we don't feel like reading the Bible, read the Bible anyway. You don't feel like praying, pray until you feel like it. You don't want to go to church and be around people, just go to church anyway. There have been times where Misty and I have had different fellowships. Like back when we were with Village Missions, there was 7 or 8 churches that the pastors, we'd get together once a month and we'd have lunch, we'd pray together, and there were times Misty would be like, I don't feel like going. I don't necessarily get anything out of it. But every time we did that, when we went and on our way back, we're like, I'm really glad we went. It was worth it. It was valuable, even though we didn't feel like it at the time. It makes a difference. And so we need to discipline ourselves to do that, because if we want to have a successful Christian life, if we want to have a ministry that's going to make a difference in the lives of other people, we need to discipline ourselves to train ourselves and work through that not wanting to work through the pain that it might come with. And just as athletes have a focused training, as Christians, we need to have a focused training as well. So first of all, what does the basic victory for a Christian look like? What does the basic victory for a Christian look like? And I think the answer to this comes in the name Christian. Basically meaning Christ ones. We're supposed to be little Christs, is what Christian means. And if we want to be like Christ, we need to get to know him more. That's what victory looks like, is looking like Christ. And if we want to do that, we need to get to know him more. We can do that through spending time in the Word, in prayer. This is how we get to know him. This is how we build our relationship with him. And we also need to make sure that we live like Jesus. Do we love God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength? Do we love our neighbors as we love ourselves? Sometimes, if we're honest. Other times, not so much. There are times where And we'll all say this, we put ourselves ahead of loving others. But then to be more specific, so that's the general, for a Christian, what does victory look like? It's looking like Jesus. To be like him. But more specifically, what would victory look like in the personal ministry of your life? For you, what would a spiritual victory look like? Would it be sharing the gospel with your neighbors, with your family? Would it become overcoming a sin that you're struggling with? What is the victory that you need to be working toward in your life today? Keeping that in mind, what are the habits and the skills that you need to develop in your life in order to have victory in that? In your personal life or in your personal ministry, as you try to love and reach out to other people. Identify these things, figure out what you need to do, and then be disciplined in working towards those goals. So for me, one of the things that I want to do is I want to have a better grasp of some aspects of theology. There's some certain things that I want to understand more. And that's a personal goal that I have that I think would make a difference in my spiritual life and in my ministry. What are the things that I need to do? Well, I've got some books that I think would be really good to not just read, but to study and to think these things through. But then I need to make sure that I actually read those. I've got the books. I just need to sit down and actually study them. I want to be better in my evangelism. Of being more bold in sharing my faith. What are the steps necessary for me to do that? Honestly, the first step that I need to do that is just to start the conversation. The guy who's pumping gas to me next to me at the gas station. Just starting that conversation. That would be the first step for me in doing that. And then pushing that into a conversation on spiritual things. But what are the first steps that you need to take in order to find the victory that is yours, your personal spiritual victory, your spiritual goal that you need? Identify that goal, figure out what the steps are that you need to take in order to accomplish that. Because if we want to be disciplined and focused in our personal lives and in our ministries, then we need to keep our focus on the goal that is set before us. And this is why we had Hebrews 12, 1 and 2, and 1 through 3 read earlier. I'm going to reread verses 1 and 2 now. It says, "Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us." So maybe that's one of the things for our goals is getting rid of that sin that's keeping us from running after God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength. "And let us run with endurance the race that is set before us." Just making the goal of, I'm not going to give up when it gets hard. I'm going to push through. And I think the key to this is keeping our eyes on the goal. Verse 2 says, "Fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God." He is our goal. We need to keep our eyes on Jesus as we run the race and fight the fight and live the Christian life. So we see that an athlete trains with purpose. And an athlete also, and this is what Paul really brings out, an athlete follows the rules. Verse 5, "And also if anyone competes as an athlete, he does not win the prize unless he competes according to the rules." So success in competition is not just about effort. It requires an obedience to the rules. Now there's a name I'm sure you probably have not heard. It's Rajpal Pannu. He's a champion runner. Ultra marathons, 100-mile races, things like that. That's what he does. And he had been working to break an American record. And he was competing. This is just last month. This is on Valentine's Day. He was competing in the USATF 100-mile championship race. And his goal was to break the American record. He finished the race over 1.5 hours ahead of the person in second place. That's a big gap. He later found out that his run was not valid for the championship because of something that we would probably view as very small, quite literally small and inconsequential. But it was in the rules, and he broke it, not intentionally, but it happened, and he was disqualified. What was wrong? The soles of his shoes were too thick. The rule stated that they could be no thicker than 40 millimeters. His shoes came in between 43 and 48 millimeters. And because of that, he was disqualified. Rules matter. And a violation of the rules, whether it's intentional or not, has consequences. And this is what Paul shows us there in 2 Timothy 2:5. You don't get the prize unless you compete according to the rules. A football team is not going to win if they keep jumping the snap. In fact, they start getting penalties and being forced back further and further. You don't win unless you compete according to the rules. And the victory that I think Paul had in mind is he's saying no one's going to have victory. No one's going to win the prize unless they compete the rules. I think he has a certain victory in mind. If we jump ahead to 2 Timothy 4:7 and 8. Why is this jumping ahead? I don't know. Okay, here we go. Athlete follows rules. 2 Timothy 4:7 and 8 says this. It says, I have fought the good fight. I have finished the course. I have kept the faith. In the future, there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. And not only to me, but also to all who have loved his appearing. So how we live as Christians is important. Victory in our ministry does depend on how we live. And Warren Wiersbe wrote about this. He said that Paul was saying to young Timothy, the important thing is that you obey the word of God no matter what people say. You are not running the race to please people or to get fame. You are running to please Jesus Christ. This is why we live as Christians. This is why we should be doing what we do to serve in ministry. If we're doing this for fame or for money, if we are loving other people because of what we might get out of it, rather than on pleasing Christ, we're not doing it right. We're not competing according to the rules. I didn't go into ministry for money. In fact, Misty and I, in our wedding vows, we specifically left out for richer, for poorer, because we knew for richer was not going to be an option. But our goal, then and now, and the goal that we should have as Christians, is to please Jesus Christ. Through what we say, through what we do, the way that we minister in the lives of other people. And so we need to serve. A minister must serve with integrity, faithfulness, and a submission to God's ways. And so if the world sees us as people whose integrity is questionable, if we aren't faithful to our calling, and we don't live as God has called us to live, then our ministries fail. We are called as Christians to a high standard. And faithfulness to that standard brings about a trust in those that we minister to. But if we fail in that regard, why should they listen to us? Why should we listen to the pastor that we can't trust? Why should I listen to that Christian who cheats in his business deals? Who doesn't do what he said he would do? If we do not have that standard of integrity, if we are not competing according to the rules, we fail in our ministry. And real briefly, we see also that an athlete strives for the prize. No athlete trains just for fun. I mean, there are people who run for fun. I don't get that. Maybe some of you do. I don't view running as fun. But like an Olympic athlete and those who are competing, they have a goal in mind. There's a goal, there's a reward, there's something that they are looking forward to doing. And likewise, Timothy is called to stay the course and finish well. The reward is not just earthly success, but the approval of Christ. We run for the crown that Paul speaks of in chapter 4. We run so that we will be able to hear God tell us, "Well done." And so let's keep our eyes focused on Christ as we run as he has called us to run. We move on to verse 6, and Paul says, the hardworking farmer ought to be the first to receive his share of the crops. A farmer works hard. This is preaching to the choir with that one, isn't it? As you know, farming is labor-intensive, requiring patience and persistence. And Paul, he's moving to this illustration. Note the adjective that Paul uses, though, for the farmer. Hard-working. Because he's contrasting the attitude of the farmer with those who would go through life with laziness. Because as you well know, to be successful or to at least survive as a farmer, you need to be patient and you need to be persistent. You have to wait for the crops to grow, for the calves to grow up. You have to wait for the rain to fall. You have to wait for those seeds to grow, for harvest to come. And if you just give up, nothing's going to happen as a result of it. Planting and harvesting aren't exactly things you can decide to do later on. I'll wait a month. It doesn't work that way. If you do that, you will fail as a farmer. It requires dedication. Proverbs 10:4-5 says, poor is he who works with a negligent hand, but the hand of the diligent makes rich. He who gathers in summer is a son who acts wisely, but he who sleeps in harvest is a son who acts shamefully. Later on in Proverbs is also written in chapter 24, 30-34, it says, I passed by the field of the sluggard, and by the vineyard of the man lacking sense. And behold, it was completely overgrown with thistles. Its surface was covered with nettles, and its stone wall was broken down. When I saw it, I reflected upon it. I looked and received instruction, and he realized that was foolish. Continues on, a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest. Then your poverty will come as a robber, and your want like an armed man. A faithful minister, like a farmer, must continually sow the truth and tend to the spiritual growth of others. Because he's not just speaking about farmers, he's speaking about our lives as Christians, as ministers of the gospel. And our ministries require that same amount of focus, dedication, and patience. And so if you have a chance to share the gospel with someone, we need to do it right away, because there is no guarantee that we will ever have a chance to talk to that person again. But we also need to have patience. Just as seeds take time to grow toward the harvest, so do the seeds of the gospel that we plant. Sometimes people need to process the message of what Jesus Christ has done. We can tell them that, but they need to think through that. Sometimes it's going to require them hearing it over and over and over again as we water the seed that has been planted of the gospel. We just wait for the harvest to come, and we tend to it faithfully in the meantime. And that's the way it is with Christian ministry. It's just a faithful tending of what God has given us responsibility to take care of. But he also says the hardworking farmer ought to be the first to receive his share of the crops. A farmer enjoys the harvest. Each of the illustrations that Paul uses here, he shows the work that is required and the reward that is given. The dedicated soldier pleases his commanding officer. The athlete who follows the rules can win the prize. The farmer receives his share of the crops. We gain blessings as we minister. I cannot tell you how excited I am when I have the chance to share the gospel with someone and I get to be there when they trust Christ. I got to be honest, that is one of the most exciting things I've ever been a part of. To see when God is making a difference in someone's life. It's exciting. It is one of the most thrilling things that I get to experience as a Christian. And God rewards us as we faithfully minister. Your ministry might be to your family, to your children. So for those of you who are parents, have been parents, or will be parents in the future, if your children are following Christ with their lives, it's a lot easier to parent them than if they're following the ways of the world. When I see that my children are wanting to follow Christ, I worry about them a lot less. So like Evan in college, Dallas, University of Texas in Dallas. I worry about him down there. But I worry about him in different ways than I would otherwise, because he's on the leadership team for a group that studies apologetics, the defense of the gospel and of God. He's on a leadership team for that. That's exciting. That makes me, I'm not worried about the trouble he's going to get in on other things. I worry about him because of a picture he sent me where he's in someone's trunk and says, "Hey, we're playing hostage." Yes, I do worry about my children. Just in different ways. He's not a partier, but he makes interesting decisions. But I'm not worried about him. When I see that my children are wanting to follow Christ, I worry about them less. And there's a joy as we see our efforts help people. And I think that we'll also see a future reward from God as well. So let's keep this psalm in mind. 126, 5 and 6. It says, "Those who sow in tears shall reap with joyful shouting. He who goes to and fro weeping, carrying his bag of seed, shall indeed come again with a shout of joy, bringing his sheaves with him." He's rejoicing in the harvest. And there is a joy that comes with a faithful ministry. When we do what God has called us to do, as we live as He has called us to do, as we endure and we are patient, we discipline ourselves to live as He has called us to do, there is a joy that comes from it. And it's exciting. You may not be able to see it on the other side of it. I got to tell you, when I was in the middle of my Greek course, Joy was the name of a girl I went to high school with. That was about it. I didn't feel joy in my heart as we were singing songs in church, because it hurt, and I was stressed, and I was honestly scared. But there was a reward when I came through that. Verse 7 at the end of our passage has Paul giving Timothy a chance to stop and think about these things. First of all, verse 7 says this: "Consider what I say, for the Lord will give you understanding in everything." And so Paul calls Timothy to reflect. He doesn't say Timothy's going to understand all of these things, these illustrations immediately. He needs to think on these and meditate on these truths. And reflection allows time for God's wisdom to take root in his heart and in our hearts. Sometimes, and this is important, we should think through what we learn from the Bible. If we do our Bible reading daily, I think it's I think it is better to do it in the morning because we have a chance to really think through the rest of the day what we read. What does God want me to learn from what I have studied? And we need to think on it, meditate, and let it take root in our heart. Because understanding doesn't just come from hearing, but from considering deeply. And the Lord gives us true understanding. This is something else that Timothy needs to understand. Timothy's not left to figure things out alone. God grants wisdom. And a dependence on God's guidance is essential for a faithful minister. And again, we're all ministers of the gospel. Depending on God's guidance is essential for that. And this is not, again, just an intellectual understanding, but it's a spiritual insight for faithful service. And then we need to apply these truths to our lives. And this is what we have up here is, are we enduring like soldiers? Staying committed despite hardships? Are we training like athletes, disciplining ourselves and following God's way? Are we laboring like farmers, working faithfully and trusting in God for the results? And then finally, will we reflect on these truths and seek the Lord for wisdom as we apply them to our lives? God has called us to serve Him. He has called each Christian to a life of ministry. Ephesians 2, 8, and 9 are verses that I quote a lot, especially when I'm sharing the gospel, but verse 10 is the one that comes out for really after someone is saved. It says, "For we are His workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand so that we would walk in them." We have things that God has called us to do as Christians. It means we need to do them. We need to be faithful in obedience in life. Is it going to be easy? No, not all the time. Is it going to be stressful? Yeah, probably. Is it worth it? Without doubt. There is a reward for faithful service, for faithful ministry. So let's keep our eyes focused on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, as we work towards the goals He has set in our lives. Pray, and then I'll have the men come forward as we celebrate communion together. Father, again, I thank You for who You are. And I'm thankful for the calling that You've placed in our hearts and in our lives as Christians. That each one of us is to be a minister of the gospel, and it's going to look differently for each one of us. Help us to see the goals that You have set in our lives. The responsibility that we have as people who are called by Your name. And let us run with endurance, disciplining ourselves, seeking You in all that we do. I ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.